at age 3, I had a nervous breakdown, and my parents moved me to Hollywood.
Hello, and welcome to episode 27 of the Who Cares Anyway podcast. My guest is William Winant. And here I will read from the bio at williamwinant.com. So, Grammy-nominated percussionist William Winant has performed with some of the most innovative and creative musicians of our time, including John Cage, Iannis, Xenakis, John Zorn, Keith Jarrett, Anthony Braxton, James Tenney, Cecil Taylor, Roscoe Mitchell, Steve Reich, Yo-Yo Ma, Frederic Rzewski, Ursula Oppens, Joan LaBarbara, Annea Lockwood, Joelle Leandre, Zeena Parkins, Danny Elfman / OingoBoingo, Mr. Bungle, Sonic Youth, and the Kronos Quartet. And believe it or not, that list is still just scratching the surface. But in this episode, we take a Bay Area-centric sort of focus, beginning with his move to the Bay Area to study at Mills College, where he then wound up teaching and continued to teach, I think, until it closed down a few years ago. And so Mills College, definitely a part of the Bay Area underground music narrative that I did not really get into in the book itself, the book being Who Cares Anyway, but it's definitely relevant. We heard a little bit about it in, I think it was episode 23 with James Good, but we hear some more about it here, along with some bits and pieces about various collaborations with, well, Mr. Bungle, Caroliner, Frank Zappa, Harry Partch, John Zorn, and the Glenn Spearman double trio. There might be a few more as well. But anyway, trying to connect the aspects of the music scene that I did talk about in the book with some of the other things that were going on in the Bay Area at the same time. One little note of clarification, there is a reference to a Gino early on, and that is Gino Robert, percussionist and head of Rastascan, the improv label based in the East Bay. And his name had come up before I hit record, and so there's a reference to him that might have been unclear otherwise. But other than that, I think it's pretty self-explanatory, and so I'll go ahead and step aside and let us get into the interview with William Winant.
I moved to the Bay Area in 1980, I think, and started school right then. I did my master's at Mills College. I think I started in the winter of 1980.
Okay. Did you go there to study with a particular professor or mentor?
I mean, I went there because I'd come from Toronto, and David Rosenboom and his partner had moved out there, so I moved out with them. And David had started to teach at Mills, and so I kind of signed up there to study, and I thought it would be a good way to get my foot in the door. Bob Ashley was there, was somebody who I really liked, so I was going to work with him, and David was there, and then just by luck, a year later, Lou Harrison ended up being there, and that's the person who I probably bonded with and connected with the most while I was at while I was a student at Mills.
How did that really, if you can call it the scene around Mills or the people that you knew around Mills, how did that connect to local music scenes, whether in the East Bay or in San Francisco? Was there any sort of connection, or was it sort of in its own sphere or bubble?
I think Mills, a lot of Mills was sort of just one of the parts of an overall scene. I think that people from Mills, people who had taught at Mills, were involved in a lot of creative music activity throughout the Bay Area, and continued to do so until it finally closed a couple of years ago. So as I said, like people like Gino ended up in the Clubfoot Orchestra. I ended up playing with all kinds of people in the Bay Area. A lot of the people from the scene either went to Mills or did concerts at Mills, or people from Mills played in other people's groups and bands. There was Mills was definitely, I think, an important part of the creative music scene in the Bay Area in general, and probably in terms of a school, probably maybe the most important one in terms of how many people came out of Mills and ended up and are still doing creative music in the Bay Area.
Right, right. Yeah, I was definitely, aware of it, even when I moved out there in the, 99 and was aware of certain names, but I learned more as time went on, but about different people who came through there. But like in what I was studying or not studying, researching and in the book that time period, say late 70s into early 80s, the the San Francisco Art Institute was really important for punk in San Francisco, but that wasn't music school. It was, people went to art school and then formed punk bands, and a lot of them were novice musicians or not terribly experienced. And then, but the Mills thing was kind of, again, in terms of the threads that I was looking at, it started to cross pollinate a little later on. Um,
There was a guy, hold on, Bob Davis.
oh, right. Okay. Yep.
He went to Mills.
Oh, okay.
You didn't have to, quote, you know, be a trained musician to go to Mills College. Anyone could go. Anyone that had an interest in some sort of creative thing, went there. And whether they could read music, not read music, whether they played an instrument or didn't play an instrument or whatever, Mills was very open in that way. Sort of similar in the way that the Art Institute was open too, was a important conduit for creative stuff and, as you say, for music. But there was this kind of, as I say, a kind of cross-pollination through the years that Mills was part of. The I guess Pauline Oliveros, and I don't know the history. I'm not a historian, but you know, Pauline and Mart Subotnick and Terry Reich, all those people started this tape music center in San Francisco. It eventually moved to Mills, and then there were people that were part of that scene um, that were also sort of involved in the psychedelic, like Tony, I forgot his name, the guy who did all those weird, kind of live slide projections for the concerts at the Fillmore and for the Grateful
Oh,
Dead and stuff like that. That stuff sort of also, it originally started at Mills College. They were already doing stuff like that. And then some of those people got involved. There was this kind of cross-pollination. So, um, you know, uh, but people went to Mills, I think mainly, to work with on maybe, to work in the electronic music studios there. And at the time I went there, it was public access. So anyone you didn't have to be a student to access the Moog synthesizers and the Buchla synthesizers and the 24 track recording studio and all of that stuff that was there. It was made available to the public. And I think that was sort of a thing that Bob Ashley had started during his tenure at Mills.
okay. It's um I've been listening to his Perfect Lives.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was his was a name that I was familiar with over the years, but had never dove into his music. And really just the last couple of years uh it's like, this is interesting. So when you moved to the Bay Area, did you anticipate staying there long term?
Um, yeah, I was going to give it the old college try, I guess. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I moved there. I had, as I said, my friend David Rosenboom, who was a colleague of mine, had moved and had taken over the Center for New Music, the Center for Contemporary Music at Mills. So he was there. I had friends also who I'd gone to college with at the California Institute of the Arts, who were now, that were firmly established sort of in the new music and classical music scene in San Francisco. And they were playing with various new music groups and in the San Francisco Ballet and with the San Francisco Symphony. So I knew them pretty well from school. So that was another reason why I moved out there, because they had moved up from LA and they were working a lot. So I was kind of like, I had that connection too, like into the sort of new music classical world, because I had friends that were already established and doing well. Though I think one of the friends said when I moved there, it'll take you 5 years before you really start working in this town or something like that. So
Did that turn out to be overly pessimistic, or was that
I actually was pretty right.
pretty right?
I mean, I actually started working consistently by 1981, 80, but even before I graduated Mel's, I was already playing festivals and guesting with various groups, and even, sometimes playing as an extra with the San Francisco Symphony and the Berkeley Symphony and different groups.
Okay. But one of the earlier sometimes in a bio they'll say things like they'll put a musician's name and then in parentheses say some people that they might have worked with. But that can be misleading because, like, let's say William Wynant and it might say it could say Lou Harrison or John Cage or Xenakis or Mr. Bungle or Sonic Youth or Frank Zappa. And I saw one of them that mentioned Frank Zappa and I thought, hmm. And then I went looked, and it seemed like that was mostly that was one performance that was done in maybe '84. Is that one of his like orchestral things in Berkeley?
Yeah, I actually did. Um, um, Frank Zappa came up and did I was in a group. I was starting to play in a group in 1984 called the San Francisco Contemporary Music Players, which was the kind of the most oldest and most established at that time new music ensemble. And they did a big benefit concert at the Opera House, and they invited Frank Zappa. It was an all Varese concert, and they invited Frank Zappa to come up and conduct the concert, and for Grace Slick to be the MC. And I think Frank Zappa at that time, being a big, a big fan of Varese's music, and had agreed to do it. And he came up and conducted several pieces. I was lucky enough to be able to play on those concerts with Frank conducting. And then maybe a year later, or it could have been before, a year later, I got to work with Frank again when the Berkeley Symphony and the Oakland Ballet collaborated playing Frank Zappa's orchestral music, and with Kent Nagano. Kent Nagano, I think, had just recorded Frank's some of these orchestral suites or something in England, and so Frank came out and rehearsed with the band. Kent Nagano was conducting, but Frank was basically in charge, running the rehearsals. So I got to work with him twice. I mean, directly when he conducted the Varese pieces. That was an amazing experience, rehearsing and doing those concerts with him. But then a year later, I think we um, did these things like Pedro's Dowry and Sinister Footwear and Mo and Herb Take a Vacation. Those pieces were done by the Berkeley Symphony, conducted by Kent Nagano, and under the supervision of Frank Zappa. So again, it was another time I got to work directly with him.
Okay, but that's one of those where it's a more familiar name to a broader audience, but it wasn't by any means one of your close associations. You've certainly
No,
had
no,
closer. Yeah.
it was a gig, but it was it was quite, the Vrest concert, we were doing, chamber pieces with like 7 or 8 musicians, or, 5 musicians. So it was a very kind of close-knit thing. It was great to be able to have that experience of actually, rehearsing and working with him and hearing you know, how he thought about those Vrest pieces. So yeah, but
Right. Yeah.
I didn't have that. If you're saying, did I have that kind of close association with Frank as I did with like people like Lou Harrison or John Cage or Steve Reich or the Mr. Bungle? No, it wasn't that close. We only worked a few times together.
You mentioned in at least one of those interviews, growing up, it's not like you came out of the womb playing contemporary classical, abstract music, that you grew up listening to rock and then kind of branching out. And I'm curious, in that period in the '80s, when it seems like most of your performances were in the new music realm, as opposed to you mentioned that, you hadn't really played with rock bands until you were in your 40s. But in
Right.
terms of your listening and your musical interest, were you always kind of all over the place, or were you really focused in that early 80s period in
Well, I think like all kids, I mean, it started off, I started listening to music, I guess, back in junior high, and
yeah.
and it was when records were easily available, and we all started collecting records and listening to the radio. So, I kind of grew up like a lot of kids, first listening to kind of popular musics, and then and then from there getting interested in high school in jazz and free jazz and in blues music and all of that kind of, I would say by the time I was in high school, I was listening to everything. In the 80s, by the time I got to Northern California, 1980, I mean, my main interest then was playing new music. That was sort of my main focus. That's how I was making, a living, was playing that music and working with people like Xenakis or local composers like Chris Brown or David Rosenboom, Lou Harrison, of course. But I kind of grew up listening to all kinds of rock music and English blues and all of that stuff when I was a teenager. And then from there, kind of exploring different things. So English blues, they were influenced by these guys, Freddie King and BB King. And then I started listening to Chicago blues and all of that. And then, of course, I was lucky in high school to have friends that had similar interests, so that, by the time, in high school, that's really where I had kind of decided that my dream was to somehow make a living doing music.
Okay, because I was just kind of wondering, because like I had a little period, let's say in college, like I got really into, I did go through a big Zappa phase, and then into, Ornette Coleman and Cecil Taylor, and then Zorn. And, but there was a little period there from maybe like sophomore to junior year in college where I was all about it. Had, it's like, oh, this rock stuff that I grew up with is below me, which is ridiculous. And then I kind of had to snap out of that. And it kind of was, a lot of the stuff that I ended up writing about, Amarillo Records and Mr. Bungle, that kind of helped snap me out of it. Even though the music in Mr. Bungle, can certainly be, advanced, it doesn't, it operates in a different sphere than.
Yeah.
And I was just curious if you ever had a time where your focus either narrowed or widened back out, because again, like, I imagine the experience of, say, I know we're fast forwarding here to say 1995, but like playing in rock clubs on the Disco Volante tour would be quite different from playing at a new music concert in Berkeley in 1985. Just the
Yeah.
overall environment, and what that shift was like.
For me, it was, it was a great experience. I kind of, for a long time, I was focused on this one thing. And maybe even in the 70s, when I was going to college, I was sort of a new music snob and not even kind of listening to popular music. I think the advent of sort of the punk scene got me more back into it somehow. Like in 77, or, I bought my like first, I bought a Sid Vicious record doing, My Way, and all of a sudden, and then I saw the Dead Boys on TV, and I said, oh, this is kind of what it kind of brought me back, snapped me back out of my snobism and said, sort of, but yes, being in, the opportunity to work with Mr. Bungle, to work with musicians that were much younger than me, and to play in a kind of rock band situation, though the music that they were doing wasn't that far off from what I was already doing in a lot of ways. Their
Right.
interests they had a lot of similar interests as me. But yeah, it was a great opportunity. In new music, you spend 3 or 4 months like learning a piece of Xenakis, and then you play it once or twice, and that's it. And the nice thing about Mr. Bungle is you learn all this music and you record it, and then you go on the road and you play it a couple hundred times. You get a chance to do it over and over again instead of just doing it once. So each time it kind of grows. Each time you have a different experience. It was kind of nice to be able to play these pieces, this music, many, many times instead of just once or twice, if that makes any sense.
Right, right.
And
No,
then
no,
the
yeah.
whole idea of being on the road and getting up in the morning and it was a very different experience, traveling in a van. It was almost like boot camp, being in this band and having to get up every morning and drive 8 hours to a gig and then schlep and unschlep and it was a lot of work, but to me it was a great experience. It was a great experience to kind of work with a whole new group of musicians, younger musicians. I got very inspired by that. But at the same time, I think that, I don't know, it was Zorn that brought us together, but there were a lot of similar interests. Somehow the people in Mr. Bungle had a kind of an affinity for what I was doing, and it fit.
Right, right. I was trying to, I was looking back at the timeline. It seems like it might have been Elegy. That was recorded in October 91 per disc, according to Discogs. And then maybe some of those game pieces were happening around the same time. But that seems
Right.
like that would have been around the time that you must have met them.
It was through Zorn that I met the people in Mr. Bungle.
Right. Yeah, I was just somebody had asked you in one of those other interviews if you remembered specifically what it was, but yeah, but I don't know if anything came back in terms of, if you all showed up at this recording session for Elegy or if you had done those game piece performances or maybe it was all right at the same time.
Well, I worked with the first time I'd heard about Zorn all through the 80s, but I really hadn't seen him perform or anything. I mean, we were on similar, like in the Bay Area, there were these like little kind of improv showcases at various galleries, and Zorn and I were on these showcases, though we performed at different times. Um, so I'd seen him, I'd heard about him. I saw that he was like doing things with like mouthpieces and bird calls and duck calls. And, I've been starting to see a lot about him. And then I um, did a festival called New Music America in 1984 at Hartford, Connecticut. I was there with Chris Brown doing a piece of his. And on that festival, it was the first I saw Zorn perform one of his game pieces. I think it was Rugby. And that was the first time I saw Zorn perform with his musicians. And I think at that time in that band was Fred Frith and Wayne Horowitz, and Robin Holcomb was conducting. And I'm not sure how Zorn was playing. I'm not just sure who else was on that gig. It was 5 musicians, but I was definitely intrigued and I loved the music, even though I had no idea what was going on because people were holding up cards and raising, doing different things. But the music was very changing a lot and very energetic, and the improvisations were great. So that was the first time I actually saw Zorn, and I was definitely intrigued. I had no idea what was going on at that time, and then by chance in 1987, I think, or 88, the Rova Saxophone Quartet, which was a new
Oh
music
yeah.
here in the Bay Area, brought John Zorn to the Bay Area to play at the Green Room, which was in, where the Museum of Modern Art was at the time, and to do Cobra, to do the sort of the West Coast premiere of Cobra. And they asked me if I would play percussion. Um, they also needed a drummer, so I suggested Gino, who was studying with me at that time at Mills. And so that was the first time I actually got to work with Zorn, and to work on a game piece called, this one was called Cobra, which might be his most well-known game piece. And
Right.
that's when I kind of felt, I when I saw this music and did it and saw Zorn and all, he also played saxophone on this concert. I just was blown away by his musicianship and totally blown away by this piece. It was pretty much the first piece using improvisation, outside of a kind of a jazz or blues based type of music, that it was the first sort of a improv piece, quote piece, that really was exciting and really worked. There were all kinds of things going on here. People had been trying to do it for years, in the classical world, come up with structures or improv pieces or prose pieces that involved improvisation. Um, um, but almost all of that stuff wasn't really successful. And then Zorn came in with Cobra, and finally there was a piece that's totally improvised, but totally structured, that completely works. Probably to this day, the greatest, piece that uses, that where improvisation is the main focus of the thing. It was a great piece, and it was great working with Zorn. I was totally into it. And after that, I guess Zorn liked what I was doing, and Zorn started to invite me to do projects with him. And one of the first projects was recording Elegy, which we did in San Francisco, which involved at least two people from Mr. Bungle, I think Trey
Yeah, and
and Mike.
Mike, right?
And then Zorn had also invited me and Mike and Trevor to do a project in Minneapolis at the Walker Arts Center. I'm not sure which came first, the Elegy or doing this kind of another card, what he called it was sort of a card file piece, which was Elegy was also this thing where all the music was on little file cards, if you know what I mean. And I think we did this Houdini Sod project in Minneapolis with Arto Lindsay and with people from Naked City, and Trevor and Patton and myself were guests. So, that's how I started to work with the Bungle guys, was through Zorn, through doing Elegy, through doing this thing in Minneapolis. Um, and then I guess they were working on Disco Volante, and they started inviting me to different sessions at different studios.
Okay.
And it ended up being, doing a lot. We ended up doing, I ended up doing a lot of recording for that record.
Yeah, I wanted to ask if you remembered doing anything at the I think it was unofficially, or I don't know how officially known as the Shotwell Bomb Factory, but I guess like Patton's Garage over on Shotwell in the Mission.
I know where that was. That was sort of where Patton was living, and I guess they were doing some recording there. I'd been there, but I never recorded in that place. All
Okay.
the stuff I did was in like real recording studios. Though, we did spend almost 10 hours, at Mills College, where I had all my percussion stuff. And, they hired a guy came with mics, and we set up in the concert hall. And I think we recorded like, we started setting up at 5, and I think we went the whole evening until the next morning, recording percussion and doing crazy overdubs. And so we spent a whole evening at Mills recording percussion one time. But I think we recorded at studios like in Emeryville, and maybe studios and maybe at Different Fur at some point, different places around town for Disco Volante.
Okay, because that bonus track, that Mind Emissions, that do you think that was from the Mills session, or do you remember where that? No.
That was from when I think I'm not sure it was a studio in San Francisco, maybe Brilliant. And, I'm pretty sure it was from the Disco Volante sessions.
Definitely was because yeah, part of that's on the album, a little
Right. I mean,
snippet of it.
on the original recording, they used
Yeah,
like
a
10
snippet.
seconds of it or something.
Yeah.
It was a part of like a secret song or something. I'm not sure how they inserted it, but there was a little like 10-second version of that. But what it was, in between takes, I was just fooling around with this Indian hand drum and doing these sort of my sort of interpretations of this guy Peter Plonsky, who was a composer I was really into, a crazy composer from the Bay Area, who he was the one that came up with the term mind emissions. His name was Peter Plonsky, and I seen him perform many times. I even started performing with him when I moved back to the Bay Area. So I was sort of doing my take on Peter Plonsky's mind emissions while I was playing the hand drum. And I guess, they were like recording me or sometimes not even sort of recording me without knowing. And they said, oh, we'll do that again. And then I would try doing these like little things I had learned on the Kanjuro when I was a student when was studying Indian music, and then doing these mind emissions at the same time with my voice. And you know, yeah, they were just outtakes, just like it's just like in between takes. I was fooling around. I didn't even know they were really recording me. And then when that first record came, I guess when Disco Volante came out the first time, they used I guess what, 10 seconds or 20
Something, yeah.
seconds, something like that, in the middle of right before something, right? Maybe before the secret song or something, or
Yeah,
after.
I think right after it, I think, because it's right before Desert Search and
Right. Okay. So
yeah,
it's after the secret song. They
yeah,
this little thing in. And then, you know, fast forward 25 years and they ended up using the whole 10 minutes of it. I didn't even realize I was doing that. It was like I completely forgot, and I didn't even realize how good I was. I mean, I was just a beginner. I always thought of myself as just a beginner in that Indian music thing because I only studied that instrument kanjura for 3 years when I was, at in school at York University in Toronto. I was studying with this Indian drummer, and so I was totally amazed to hear to hear it. It sounded great. And I think they used they put the piece together 10 minutes and added it as a bonus track for this Rhino Records thing that came out, a box set, which is
right.
beautiful. So I was very honored. It's the first time that I ever got a quote composition credit. I think they even put W. Winant under, Mind
Uh,
Emission, gave me a credit. So yeah, I was very honored that they did that and touched. I felt, wow, thank you.
but I was curious how, because I imagine with a fair amount of what you were recording, it was you would be playing along with the existing tracks, playing a part, but then
Correct.
probably also I was wondering how much of what you did might have been along those lines where maybe they're giving you some direction or saying do more of this. Were you doing a lot of a fair amount of other stuff like solo like that?
Um, I think when we were at Mills, we were just, yeah, there was a lot of experiment, trying things out or experiment. They gave me a lot of leeway in some songs, like the timpani, playing timpani in some things, or I mean, obviously there were parts that were totally kind of quote written out, or I learned by rote, or they'd give me guide tracks to play with. And yes, a lot of it was overdubs. A lot of it, I would say more than half of it was composed, through composed stuff that I had learned. But then there were other parts where they said, gave me an idea, or said, this is what it's like, and, try this, try that, and they would kind of shape it. And that was more or less maybe, um, you know, coming up with these ideas at the spur of the moment. So let's say coming out of sort of improvising a part or doing this and then finally settling on something. So it was a combination of stuff, but there were definitely more than half of the material on Disco Volante and on the second record I did with them. A lot of it was already sort of composed.
Yeah, and I would imagine that was a higher proportion on California just because you don't have those, doesn't have the interludes.
Wow. There was
That
more
yeah,
part, for California, I was playing more kind of parts. But Disco Volante, there was they did give me a lot of creative freedom, let's say, but there was still, again, a lot of it, were kind of like composed parts, like in Trey's song, Mishka something or
right.
other. That's
Yeah.
all. That pretty much all the xylophone parts were totally written out by Trey, and or sung by Mike. And then sometimes Mike would even he would sing my part as a guide track, so that even though they wrote it out, it was easier to kind of follow the written part with what Mike was singing, so that I could be right with him. So yeah, there were, it was a combination of all kinds of things, written out parts, coming up with ideas, some parts letting me kind of come up with ideas. So it was a combination of a lot of different things. Um, but it was, especially Disco Volante, I felt like, I had some creative input on some of the percussion parts.
you had more and more appearances on, I mean, in a very broad sense of the word, rock band albums. Yeah, Barbara Manning,
Yeah.
Wandering Stars, later Dieselhead, Virgil Shaw. Um, and so at that
So
point,
Carolina, I played on
there,
three with
I
them.
wanted to, I did want to ask about that. Yeah, what was that like? How much, what was the direction like in that versus, I imagine it wouldn't be notated.
No, no.
Right.
Carolina. First, I have to give props to my student. I was when I had a really great student at UC Santa Cruz named Rakesh Khanna, and he was the one that turned me on to Carolina. Matter of
Okay.
fact, I think he was at a show and he called me up on the phone. He said, "Man, you got to hear this. You got to come hear this music. You got to hear this thing." And so I went and saw because of Rakesh. Um, I went and saw Carolina for the first time live, I think in a basement at some club in Berkeley. And I was totally blown away. It was a great band. And, Phil Franklin was in it. And I think Laura Allen was singing in it. And Grux was doing his thing, reading from a big book. And, it was like, and they were all in these weird day glow kind of costumes and boxes. And I just thought the music, it was really great. And, I don't know how I maybe I reached out to Grux or I came up to him after the show and said how much I dug it and I think I saw him again at the Great American Music Hall. Maybe that was a big show with the Thinking Fellers
Right. Okay. Yeah.
and I went
Halloween show.
I
Yeah.
went up to Grux and told him how much I dug it or something. And then I think after a while Grux just I started hanging out with, he invited me over to his pad and then we would listen to records um, and I told him I think I said I would love to play in this group and he invited me to play with them. And he said that, I'm not sure when this period was, but it was in
It,
the 90s.
it would have been, yeah, that Halloween show, I'm pretty sure was 93. And
I started playing with them after that, but it was Rakesh, my student, turned me on to them. I kind of reached out to Grutz and came to the shows. Grutz invited me, to hang out at his place and eventually, um, invited me to said you could play in a show if you make a costume. That was the condition. And I said, well, I'm not artistic, So Grux helped me, go dumpster diving for materials. And then I would go to his house and he would basically babysit me through making a kind of weird box I would sit in, day glow box. And then I started on certain one night a week. I think he had rehearsals at, in his house up in his attic. And I would just start going up to those things and hanging out. The music was completely, he would give like verbal instructions or some ideas, and then we would just play. So nothing was written out. It was pretty much completely up to the musicians how they would interpret, Grux's ideas. Grux already had his words, and I guess my first show with them was at the On Broadway, which would have been. I have a poster from it. It could have been like something Leaf was one of the bands that had Leaf in their name. Um,
well, that would be on, well, on Broadway, but the on Broadway itself, I thought had closed by that point, but it could have been a different
it was like
venue
I don't know if it wasn't maybe it was still the on
than
Broadway
the
show. I think
facility.
at the
Okay.
punk club it might have closed, but they were doing shows upstairs on,
Okay.
up on the
Interesting.
top.
Interesting. Okay.
Maybe that show had Tarnation on it and something Leaf but that was my first show with them and and that's when I got to know Phil, was through
Okay.
playing with Carolina and I just, thought Phil was like one of the greatest drummers of all time. Plus, he was easy to play with, so I kind of just followed him. I mean, I just had like maybe one or two tom toms and a cymbal or something very simple. Um, but I did a show with them, and I remember all the work. It was like a ton of work moving costumes and props and instruments up and downstairs. I didn't get home until like 4 or 5 in the morning that day. So I did that show. And I might have done one other show with them. And then by that point, it was like, I realized it was too much work for me to do that. It was fun to do. So I did two shows, but then every once in a while, Rex would invite me to his place to record. So I must have made two records, two or three. I even lent Grux a Harry Partch instrument that I had found in the 80s, in the under the stage at Mills College, and I kind of salvaged it. No one seemed to know why it was there or anything. So I said, I asked Grux if he, would take it for a while. So for about a year or two, he kind of lived in Grux's attic or in Phil's room. And I think we even made a record, using that instrument, as part of well, I know we used that instrument on one of the records.
Was it a string instrument?
It was a stringed instrument. It was called the Surrogate Cathara. It was a
Okay.
prototype. It wasn't. It was an instrument that he had made for a student when Partch was at Mills College in the 50s, and he had done production of his opera, I guess, called Oedipus, with the students at Mills. I mean, there are even videos of kind of an all-woman ensemble playing his music, playing this piece. But he built this kind of prototype. It was a two-tiered kind of a stringed instrument with a glass rod that would, if you moved it, it would bend the notes, kind of like kind of, I guess the closest thing, kind of had a pedal steel guitar sound to it because you could, do these glisses with the glass rod. And that instrument, I guess the student left it at Mills. It ended up under the stage for many years. And then I was like prowling around under there and I found it. And so, for a couple of years, it lived at Grux's place in the city.
That seems symbolic in a way, because
Yeah. I
that
mean,
that passing of the
I don't, they're similar in a way. I've a lot of similarities between Partch and Grux in terms of their creativity and their artistic vision and all of that.
right. See, I had never heard that story before, but that at least in a loose sense, that comparison had come up between them, and um, it is interesting thinking about how bringing it back to Mills. I didn't realize that Harry Partch had been at Mills, but that's
Oh yeah,
points to this Bay Area kind of continuum that's even longer than been in place longer than had realized in terms
right.
of attracting. I mean, I guess Harry Partch. I have this book that I still need to read that's about San Diego music in the 70s, underground experimental music called what is it called? Alien Territory? I can't remember. It came out around the same time as mine did, and so I ordered it and I still haven't read it, but I know that there were some figures from Pauline Oliveros and Harry Partch who wound up in San Diego.
I mean, Partch lived in Encinitas, which is just and in the San Diego area for like 20 years almost. And his
Okay.
instrument is main collaborator person, Dan Lee Mitchell, was the percussion teacher at San Diego State University. And that's where most of the Partch instruments lived for a long, long time.
Oh,
And
okay.
um, as a student at Cal Arts once, me and my percussion buddies, we one day actually just went down there with a couple bottles of wine. We knew where he lived and knocked on his door and hung out with Partch for a whole day. Took us to like the Balboa Park where we had a picnic and drank wine, and then he took us, to the university, to the state college, where the instruments were, and we got to see the instruments, and it was it was an amazing time. It was right before he died, but yeah, Partch did live in San Diego for quite a while.
Okay. So yeah, so it's not as if the Bay Area has a monopoly on whatever you would call this kind of thing, but there is something that
Partch lived for a long time in Petaluma. He also
Petaluma,
lived in Petaluma.
Petaluma.
Wrote one
Okay.
of his most famous pieces up
Right.
there. On the seventh day petals fell in Petaluma. But
Right.
so he spent time in the Bay Area quite a bit. Um, and again, just going back to Grux and Partch, the three letters that come into mind when I think of both of them is D I Y. Is that right?
Right. Yeah.
I mean, that they're masters of that. You know, Partch, did it him. It was all do it yourself type of stuff. He did it all of it, built his own instruments, created his own music, did it outside of the mainstream. And it looks like, and to me, when I think of Grux, he does the same thing. He kind of does it all himself. It's all,
Right. And it really is outside of even the I mean, there's mainstream in the sense of pop music, but there's also the sort of arts, official arts sort of
yeah,
infrastructure that it would involve getting grants. And not to say that any of that is easy, but he is outside of that as
yeah.
well. Yeah.
And so is Parch,
Part.
basically.
Okay.
Parch
Right.
depended on the kindness of strangers, let's say. And,
Right.
Grux just managed to do it on his own without any help. He did it all on his own. It's outside of academic institutions or grants, corporations or however, a lot of music gets done these days. I have to say too, for me, I kind of operated that way too. I never applied for a grant or a corporate grant or a NEA or, I never did any of that or apply to the Ford Foundation or the Getty or this or that. What is it called? The Guggenheims, and
Right. Right.
I never did any of that. Um, Maybe I should have, but I didn't. And so I, in a way, was sort of like that as well. But definitely Grux, Parch, these people totally operated outside of the mainstream. And as you say, even the kind of fringe mainstream, they were, way over on the left. And that's something that I admired about Grux and something I definitely admire about Arch as well.
Right. I'm just this is probably not a fair characterization, but I've seen descriptions of this probably wouldn't describe the kind of musical education that you had, but there might be a stereotype of certain, say, quote, classical musicians who can read anything but have trouble adapting in situations where they're not reading. And that doesn't sound like that would have ever been an issue with you in terms of you come going from a situation where, like, I know you've had plenty of situations when people compose music specifically for you, uh,
Right.
and then but you're coming into a situation like maybe with Mr. Bungle where it's half and half, and going into Grux's attic, which is probably a pretty far cry from some of these other environments that you'd worked in, but you obviously don't have an issue like adapting to that kind of situation. Is there something with certain kinds of formal music education that makes it difficult for musicians to adapt
Well,
without? Yeah.
I should state first that Um, I started music mostly when I was in junior high and high school as an improviser.
Okay.
I would like, have people come over to my garage and we would just sort of, improvise or free jazz. I started off mainly as an improviser or,
Okay.
playing in blues bands, something like that. I never really I didn't start my classical training really until my last year in high school. And
Okay.
that was through help of some friends who recommended some teachers. And, I think I started taking formal drum lessons in my last year in high school. And then once I was out of high school, I started taking classical lessons with a really great woman percussion teacher. And I felt like in the beginning, I was like, I felt like I was really into kind of like free improv and free jazz and stuff like that all through high school. But I felt like I needed a grounding. And so I kind of thought, well, as I, in high school, as I started to get into people like Stravinsky and Terry Riley and Steve Reich and, um, even people like Braxton and things like that, I kind of started to get this interest in new music. So I thought I would study classical music as a way of getting a kind of technical grounding, like to develop some sort of technique to be better at as an improviser. I mean, I was even buying classical pieces that had improvisation titles, like Boulez had a piece called Improvisation sur Mallarmé, and I thought when I bought the record, I was buying an improv record, but then somebody told me it's all written out. And I said, oh, that's something I could get into. I really liked. I mean, so in a way, um, before I started learn how to read music and study formally contemporary music, I was already kind of doing crazy improv stuff and weird noise things and stuff with my friends in high school. So for me,
Okay.
it's like I never really left being an improviser in a way. So when
Okay.
when people would ask me to do things to make stuff up or come up with my own ideas or be in a be more creative, I was already doing that by pretty much starting in high school. And the
Okay.
classical thing and the reading thing was like second, like okay, but and then I learned, oh, I can make money from this, and I can, actually, I don't know. So a lot of classical musicians or people that come out of that world that go to Juilliard and stuff like that. They'd been playing in youth orchestras and stuff like that since they were like 7 or 8 years old, and I didn't
Okay.
do that later until my last year in high school, and then after that I started to get into that. If that makes
Okay,
sense.
that does okay, and then on the improv sort of front, at the same time I was learning about Mr. Bungle and this other stuff that I wound up focusing on in the book. I was also coming across like the Glenn Spearman stuff and that double trio, which actually was two separate trios, right? I mean,
Yeah,
in a sense, that so you had been doing the under the name Room, I guess Chris Brown and
Larry Oakes.
Oaks, that's right, right, and then Glenn Spearman's with Donald Robinson and Lyle Ellis and that was that during the Bean Benders era, or what kind of places would that outfit play at?
Um, at Heinz Afterworld Lounge.
Ah, okay.
Hear about that?
Peter Conheim was
Oh,
telling
well,
me
there
about
was a
that.
woman that ran that. That was really. I'm having a senior moment, but it was run by this really creative person, a woman, and it was this club like on off of Grand Avenue near Broadway.
Lexa Walsh. Is
Yeah,
that
Lex.
it?
It
I had to
was
let,
her
yeah.
baby, and Room started playing there. I think actually somebody had hipped Mr. Bungle to Room or something, and so maybe they had maybe come and seen Room play it at one point. So they might have, and Mr. Bungle guys might have known about me even before I started to know who they were.
And
Uh,
that was really, I think Trevor would be the one who was the most oriented toward the jazz improv side of things, or
Now,
is
let
that
me just say, I'm not a jazz musician, but I guess the double trio could be put into that category. But yeah, I mean, places like the Heinz Afterworld Lounge, we played at a lot, and some weird, venues in downtown Oakland that I can't even remember their names. And Bean Benders, of course, was around then. Maybe that was a little later. And there were clubs also in San Francisco. There was one like sort of on the bay that had an sort of improv core or something like that, they called it. Um, I can't remember
okay?
the name. It was
Then
right on
then
the water.
yeah. Later when by the time I got out there in 99 2000, there was the Luggage Store Gallery,
No,
which
that
would be
was
a place where Gino Rivera would play with some of his
exactly.
kind of crew.
Oh, there
And
was a club in the Mission called Radio Valencia.
oh, right, right. Yeah, because there's that Marco Anidi album, live at Radio Valencia, where there's a fire truck that went through it
Right.
on the cover. And I never saw Glenn Spearman play because he died right around that time. But I saw Marco play a few times and
Marco
inter
and Glenn were good friends.
right, right. And I interviewed, that was one of the first, along with the trade article in 2002, I interviewed Marco. Those were among the first handful of things I wrote for the Guardian in terms of like feature articles. But you mentioned Santa Cruz. Was there a time when you relocated down there?
No, I did this in the in 82, 83. I started to work with Xenakis, and I did this big festival at Cal Arts, a big new music festival in the spring of 83. I'd already been performing the Xenakis solo piece for about a year and a half. I did the West Coast premiere. I'd done it in LA. I did it in San Francisco at the Museum of Modern Art, blah, blah, blah. And I guess they couldn't find anyone in Los Angeles, out of 9 million people, that wanted to play the solo percussion piece. And they basically couldn't find anyone in California at that time. So they asked me at the last minute if I'd come down, because Xenakis was one of the guest composers, along with, Steve Reich and Lutoslawski and John Adams and Morton Fell. All these people were there. So they invited me down, and it was sort of a big break for me to play at this big festival. And I did this. I worked with Xenakis on the piece. We did it, blah, blah, blah. And then I guess through that concert, some people who were teaching at Santa Cruz were there, and thought, Santa Cruz was looking for a permanent percussion teacher. And actually, there was a woman also teaching at Santa Cruz at that time who I'd worked with with the Steve Reich group back when I was in Washington. And so it was sort of through that festival, working with Xenakis and my work with Steve Reich and this woman, Linda, that they invited me to audition, and I got the job to teach starting in the fall of '83 at UC Santa Cruz. And it was a very, let me just emphasize, super, super, super part-time job, like 3 hours a week. But it was enough money that paid my rent so I could get off food stamps. So, so that was sort of my foot in the door. And for the since 1983, one day a week, for a couple hours, I go up there, or a few hours now, and go up there and I teach part-time percussion and percussion ensemble. So
Okay.
I never lived there. I just one day a week commuted there to teach at the university, to make a long
Okay.
story short.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. The whole, thinking about these different cultural centers in the United States, that LA is studio, to make a living as a studio musician, that would be kind of
Right.
where you would go. And conversely, if they need to find somebody to play new music, they're going to have to go outside, outside of LA. Maybe
At
not
that
now.
time,
At
that
that
was
time, yeah,
1982, 83. That's not the case anymore.
right.
Now, there are great musicians everywhere that like to do new music and premiere new pieces. And Xenakis now has become like, you can't go to a conservatory or a music school, at the college level and not do Xenakis on your recital. It's sort of become the standard repertoire. So back in the day, in those days, no one, I would say when I premiered on the West Coast, Xenakis 1981 or 82, I was one of only 3 people in the country that played that piece.
Okay. Okay.
Well, thousands of people the world over are playing that music.
I was amazed because I went to graduate school in Indiana, not for music, but that it's Xenakis had spent time in Bloomington
Yeah,
at some point, and they published, I guess, one of his books or formalized music.
yeah.
That would that would have been
And
something.
Indiana is a famous music school, especially for string players. Matter of fact, I think it's Indiana. Isn't that where that movie Breaking Away is about?
Exactly. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they have a famous string department there. And actually, 2 of the string, I think Hank Dudd and John Renaud from the Kronos, the original Kronos string quartet, they came
Okay.
from, that's where they went to school before they started working with the Kronos.
Okay. Okay.
So
But
back in the late 70s.
okay. But I never got the sense that it was like a real hotbed of avant-garde.
No, no, wasn't
Yeah.
a hotbed of
Yeah.
avant-garde. It was a hotbed of, if you want to play in a string quartet or be in an orchestra, you could go to that university and they would help you out a lot. That would be probably a good thing to do.
Right. Right. And okay. And let's see. There was something else that came up oh, was there ever any point where you had because a lot of people in the there would be this sort of pull for a lot of musicians in the Bay Area to move to New York at some point.
I
Was that ever a temptation or something that you looked at?
never.
Never.
I mean, I come from New York. I was born in Brooklyn.
Right.
And I think at age 3, I had a nervous breakdown and my parents moved me to Hollywood, around, like I was maybe 3 years old, something like that. And I've been in California. I mean, other than the 5 years I was in Toronto going to college, or 4 years, which I loved, I'm basically a West Coast person. I love being in California, whether it's Los Angeles or the Bay Area. It's just sort of like um, where I feel at home. I mean, I've knock on wood, I've had a lot of really great opportunities um, to work with some of the greatest musicians and companies in New York, people like John Zorn and the Merce Cunningham Dance Company and the Mark Morris Dance Group and um, Sonic Youth and all of these people. So I've had many, many opportunities. I just was a few weeks ago just in New York playing with Thurston Moore, at the Knockdown Center opening for Noy, and I played at the opening, one of the openings for John Thorne's drawing show, art show at the Drawing Center in Soho.
All
Uh,
right.
so when I was working with Mark Morris Dance Group, I was constantly going to New York and working with him and Yo-Yo Ma, people like that. But at the
Okay.
same time, I can play with the Glenn double trio or do overdubs for the Wandering Stars, or with some stuff with the Secret Chiefs, or hang out with Grux, or I was very lucky in that. I guess at a certain point, maybe in the um, very early 90s, I had an opportunity to move to the city. So like from like 91 or 92 until like 2000 or 2001, I lived in San Francisco. And I would say that's when I really hooked up with all of, with Grux and with Barbara and, working with the Wandering Stars, or, hooking up with Dieselhead and Virgil Shaw, or, working with Phil and Franklin, or, maybe, working with Christine Shields, or, playing some ragtime with Lara Allen. I mean, I met all those people when I was living in the city mainly, and started working with all those people when I was living in the city.
Right, right. Because at one level, there's the Bay Area, but when you're out there, yeah, it's like once if you're going to cross the Bay, it's got to be a pretty good reason.
Right.
Otherwise, it gets kind of like it's not that easy. It's
It's not
to
that
do.
easy, but in general, the Bay Area it was a great scene. The '90s, the part, what you're talking about in your book, is very important. Matter of fact, I did a show at the On Broadway where I shared a bill with Arkansas Man, and I was
Ah,
pretty good friends with Glenn Servisto at that time. That would have been, the early '80s.
I wonder if it was that one that was billed as Horn Reborn on the flyer, where there's
It was
Tragic
put
Mulatto
on
Club.
by Barbara Golden and one of her friends, Melody Ferris, I think. Um,
Okay.
I forgot what it was. It could be that. It was like Bob Ashley was on it, Arto
Oh,
Lindsay.
oh, this was different. Okay. Yeah.
Arkansas Man played because they were friends with Barbara Golden, and
Okay.
got to know them. Glenn, they were, pretty Arkansas Man, pretty wild group at the time. And I did my mind emissions thing on that on Broadway show, on the same bill as
Ah,
Arkansas Man and Arto Lindsay and George Lewis and all of this stuff. And
how
so
about that? I didn't know. I didn't have any idea. I never came
other
across even.
connection.
Yeah.
I kind of the interesting thing about your book is and all your podcasts, pretty much everyone on that I've worked with or collaborated with or are friends with, whether it was Lara or Phil or
Christine.
Christine, Trey, all of those people I have a deep connection with in terms of artistic collaborations and um, camaraderie or whatever the
Right.
word is.
That's another. I would always appreciate it when I would see a like. I was like, hey, that means he listened to it or probably listened to it, and then I would realize, oh yeah, it makes sense because you played on Christine's album or a lot of these things you're telling me I didn't necessarily know, but Phil had mentioned how when he went on tour with Secret Chiefs, he was sort of learning your parts
Right.
or um,
Phil, actually, I invited Phil to play with me and Terry Riley. We did a concert honoring Terry Riley at Mills, and I invited Phil to play the Pulse for NC. So he was sitting
ah.
right next to me. So I think that was a probably Phil's one excursion into the new music world. He was great. Yeah, there is definitely something about doing stuff in California that's different. than doing it in New York City. The one drawback might be that, you know, all the main publications that everyone around the world reads, like the New Yorker and the New York Times, and this and for a while in the 70s and 80s, the Village Voice when it was important. That's where the press was. So a lot of stuff that happened in California, whether it was in the Bay Area or LA, in terms of the creative music scene, didn't get that kind of attention.
Right.
So, in terms of the new music world, people, less people knew about like what Lou Harrison was doing in Aptos, California, than they would know in New York City what he was doing. Even Terry Riley, who did, is a Bay Area person, he lived in New York for a little bit, but came back because he preferred to live here and do his work. And that might have, in certain ways, maybe he would have had an even bigger career if he'd stayed in New York, but that's not who he was. And because of because of where he lived in the environment, you get this great music. Same with Partch, same with, a lot of people live there, come from the West Coast. In my world, Harold Budd is another one comes to mind from Los Angeles. That his, this music could probably only have done from people living in California or especially in Northern California. That scene in that creative music scene that had started I guess in the 70s and went all the way. It's still going on.
Right. Yeah.
There's that it hasn't died, but there was maybe the heyday where it could have, like one of its high points was in the 90s and early turn of the century. There was all this great stuff going on, creative music. And I think a lot of that's a nice thing about your book. A lot of people don't get that when they think about San Francisco. I guess they think about, the early, maybe the psychedelic days or something like that, or the 60s. And I mean, yeah, that was a fertile time. But there was equally as much creative stuff going on and stuff that was going on in the Bay Area that wasn't, that was totally unique and different from any other thing in the world. And I have to, I've even seen people like, like kind of dismiss it because you have bands like Journey or Stephenson Star, we built this city on rock and roll. I mean, I actually like those songs, actually. I don't, fuck them. I don't care. I mean, they put people like put the Bay Area down for like a couple songs even, you know what I mean? When in fact it's just as rich a history as anywhere in the world or, in my humble opinion. And as I say, you wouldn't, there's just unique things about the Bay Area you would never get anywhere else, and California in general.